before we get started, let me just introduce or tell you a little bit about myself, and it's really why you should listen if I give a talk on setting a vision and talking about being agile. So I grew up in New York City. I started as a CS major and then just said, you know what, I really want to move into the more creative side, not that being a CS major isn't creative. So I ended up being an English and art major. And I've spent 15 years in product and tech, primarily in the retail and e-commerce space. My path into product is probably very similar to a lot of people when you ask them. It's very meandering, not a very direct way, so not very linear. So I've spent time in analytics, in design. I've done some front-end development. I've done some I was a DBA, and along the process, I've had the opportunity to build and scale products and teams. So very, very fun stuff, and solve very interesting challenges. So that's what my non-linear path looks like, getting into product. And then once I got into product, it became fairly linear. So I worked at companies, large companies like Verizon and Time Warner, companies mid-sized like Zappos, and then various stages of startups from your high growth Rent the Runway, excuse me, to early stage, if only, to a later stage like One Kings Lane, and super hot off the presses. It's not yet even on my LinkedIn yet. I just started my new role at Boxed as the VP of product there. How many of you have heard of Boxed? Oh, yay, yes, okay. Bulk shopping, groceries were great. So those who haven't heard of it yet, please check us out. All right, so what am I here to talk to you about? If you have ever come to my previous talks, I always talk about framework, and because I just find that we all need help, and so I don't want to give you nothing to walk away with. Again, we are PMs or people breaking into product. We like to know, okay, what are the rules, right? What is a framework that I can use? So the framework that I'm going to talk about today is a way for you to think about crafting your vision and how to get there iteratively. And so the area or the type of framework that I'm going to be talking about is Agile. It's just one way. I'm not saying it's the perfect way. It's one way that's worked for me. So it's a way of thinking and a guide in terms of how to get to your vision and how to get there iteratively based on learnings. And then lastly, it acts as a common language for all of us, right? We're humans, we communicate. At the end of the day, we are all PMs who like building stuff, building software. And we work with a lot of different folks, engineers, designers, analytics, and other cross-functional partners, probably like marketing, etc. So we all need to have a shared language that we can rely on. All right. Little change of pace. Does anybody know what this is?
Armstrong.
Yes, thank you. Why is this relevant? So it's relevant for a couple of reasons. One, because I love anything space. I'm a big nerd. But two, it's 2019, and 50 years ago in July, we landed on the moon. So talk about the mother of all product launches, guys. Landing on the moon, right? So everybody knows, oops, let's not do that yet. Everybody knows this. Hopefully it'll play. Now, it's deliberately, you can't really hear it very well because guess what? It was in the 60s and it was from the moon, you guys. So this is really amazing stuff. So I want to use the moon landing as a backdrop of think about like, you do your product launch. Everybody feels like, okay, this is so exciting, hooray. Or maybe it'll look like, hold on, hopefully it doesn't get stuck. Maybe it'll look like this. Probably not for all of us, right? At the end of the day, it's probably us in a room saying, okay, we launched, this is so exciting. But regardless, when you do a launch, there's a bunch of people involved. In the case of the moon landing, it was all of these people in mission control, and I'm sure more and more people. In the case of Apple, it could look like this. It's actually not the same team who built the iPhone, but hey, it's an Apple team. Either way. But the whole point is, how do you get a group of people rallied around a giant vision and get them to move quickly, get them to move efficiently, and get them to move together? So it all starts with a vision. In the case of the moon landing, President Kennedy actually set that stage, and I'm going to play a snippet of his speech, which is a super historic speech. If you guys haven't heard it, read it, whatever, do it later. Listen to his language. Again, it's just a snippet, and we will talk about how this embodies I'm not going to say the perfect way to state your vision, but it's a really good framework in which to state your vision.
Why choose this as our goal?
Go to the moon is basically.
And they may well ask, why climb the highest mountain? Why 35 years ago, fly the Atlantic? Why does Rice play Texas? We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other thing. Not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills. Because that challenge is one that we're willing to accept, one we are unwilling to postpone, and one we intend to win, and the other two.
So, very exciting. I'm feeling very pumped. They're clearly pumped. Hopefully you're pumped. He's delivered the vision. He's delivered this challenge. Why is it important? Why is the phrasing important? Can anybody at least, what are you taking away from his words?
Kind of a gauntlet. He's throwing out the challenge people.
Yep, very true.
You're embracing the challenge.
Embracing the challenge, exactly.
He's using very clear, simple language so people can understand without having any background.
Yes, exactly. All of that is correct. So how are we going to get there? I'm going to talk about this iterative framework. There's 4 steps. First, we're going to define your vision. Then you're going to plan your route. Then you're going to kick it off. And then you're going to check in and repeat. So we talked about defining the vision and what are the elements of making a vision big, grandiose, exciting. It could be like this, where it's like very much a matter-of-fact thing. This is what we're going to do. We're going to go boldly where no one has gone before. That's great, but it's probably missing a few more elements. What is your vision? Can you talk about what is the goal or problem you're solving? When you talk about your vision, you really need to focus on 2 things, the what and the why. So going back to the Kennedy speech, you're absolutely right. He threw down the gauntlet. He spoke about the what, going to the moon. Then he spoke about the why. And the why, he said many, many things, but at the end of the day, it was really about rallying and putting forward America, particularly during that time of the space race. But he did it in a very bold, very clear, very easy to understand way. So when you think about crafting your vision, make sure you think about those elements. Think of President Kennedy. Think about going to the moon. That should be your North Star, right? You're thinking big as product managers, but you also need to talk about why. So again, if you've come to one of my other talks, I've talked about a 1-pager. I'll give you the cliff notes. The bottom line is when you write your vision, you're talking about the problem you're solving, you're talking about who you're solving it for, and really making sure that it's clear, it's bold, it's precise. Because otherwise, my friends, do not fall into the pit trap of many, many, many of us product managers where we just build and are not very clear why we're doing it. Trust me, if you build it, they don't come if you don't have a clear vision. So, you've written your vision, fantastic. You've like thrown down the gauntlet, you are ready to go, you are sharing it with your team. But now what? What do you do next? So let's do a quick review on Agile and Scrum. And again, like I said, definitely I am not saying this is the only way, but this is certainly one way that could work for your team. It's a software development methodology, or a series of it, because there's different kinds. It's iterative with continuous feedback so that you can definitely improve over time. And it's all about continuous, it's planning, it's testing, it's integration. It's not meant to be a bloated process. It's supposed to be lightweight, and you should be able to adapt to it. So I always like to say, well, it's the flavor of Agile that you happen to be using in your company. So when I was at Zappos, we had like the Zappos flavor of Agile, and we took it and we made it work for the different teams. Same thing when I was at Rent the Runway, same thing when I worked at One Kings Lane. So make it work for you. It's supposed to be adaptable. And lastly, this is the most important one, you guys, is the fact that it is a methodology that allows us to empower people to work together, to make decisions together, but quickly and effectively. It doesn't become like decision by committee. You're still very self-organized and moving quickly. So then, okay, we have this understanding of what Agile and Scrum is. How do we apply it to planning our route? So let's go back to the moon landing. There were 11 human space flights to get to the moon. So Apollo 7 through 17. I mean, there were other ones, but we're talking about human piloted space flights. The first 4 were to test the spacecraft, and then 6 out of 7 actually landed at the moon. 6 out of 7, just total trivia because of Apollo 13, right? Everybody's seen the Tom Hanks movie. He was great, didn't go to the moon. So then what does that mean for us in terms of practical application of this? Each mission had a goal. If you're curious, you can go to the NASA site and you can actually see each Apollo mission and the mission objectives. Testing the capsule. I can't even tell you everything, but that, or watch Tom Hanks From the Earth to the Moon. Great series. So treat your sprints as Apollo missions. So what does that mean? They have to have goals. When you do sprint planning, don't just sit with your team and say, okay, these are the tickets that we're going to work on. Don't start with that. You got to start with, what are we trying to learn for this sprint, right? What are the goals that we're hoping to achieve? And really, truly, as much as possible, what you need to look at is it has to, at the very, very end, and maybe it's not one sprint, maybe it's 2, it needs to be shippable enough in order for you to achieve that goal that you set out. So you start with a goal, and you figure out, okay, here are the tickets, the tasks, the stories that we need to achieve that goal, and then go back and say, okay, do we have enough resources to actually complete and make sure that we can ship and achieve that goal? So before we even get into the sprints themselves, take the time, whether it's with your tech lead, with your designers, whoever you need to bring into a room, call it brainstorming, call it grooming, whatever you want to call it, pre-sprint planning. The bottom line is spend the time to look at your vision and map out, okay, what are the sprints that we need to do in order to get to our vision? Make sure you engage your team and brainstorm. It really is critical to come in and say, okay, we know it's going to take a couple of hours, maybe a couple of these like 2-hour sessions, bring pizza, do whatever, but talk about the stories. Look at any mock-ups or comps. Split the tickets if you need to. Get your team to estimate. People are so afraid. Engineers are afraid to estimate, but you got to do it. So if we don't get it right this time, we'll get it right the next time. And then we course correct. But you have to spend the time, because otherwise you're just going to have sprints for the sake of sprints, and you're actually not shipping anything. And guess what? You don't ship. You don't get to your goal. You don't get to your vision. And then the most critical after each sprint, reassess. What did you learn? What worked? Because here you go. This guy clearly wants to do the work. He's ready to do the work. You got to just sweat. You got to, or maybe sparkle in his case, because otherwise there's just, you got to do the grunt work. Otherwise you're wasting people's time. So understanding that you have to do the pre-sprint planning or the grooming, now you're ready to kick it off. So let's talk about the sprint. Like, I've used this word. What is a sprint, you guys? Can anybody tell me? Yes.
It's your Scrum iteration cycle. Choose different lengths. It might be 1 week, it might be 2 weeks, but it's the part that you do on and it should be consistent.
Yeah.
Like the sprint should be consistent throughout your cycles. So that's what you frame all your ceremonies, all your Agile.
Perfect. I think you don't need this talk. You're absolutely right. So again, I'm going to stress the goal and learnings, because take anything away from this talk, it's that. If you are not starting with that, there's no point. We might as well just not do any of this. And yes, so the duration is typically 1 to 4 sprints. A lot of teams do 2-week sprints, depending on the team size, the velocity, the experience of the engineers. You might choose to do 1, you might choose to do 3, you might choose to do 4, but a lot of teams do 2 weeks. And again, it should end in potentially shippable code. How many here have like done sprint planning, they've done sprints, and then all they do is they find themselves moving the tickets from one sprint to the other? How many? I bet you all of us, right? And that's because we didn't do the estimates, we didn't set our goals, and we're just sort of like, oh sure, we'll just move it to the next sprint. But again, you're just spinning your wheels when you do that. You're not really completing, and you're not really getting closer to the vision that you set up as the product manager. And this is critical, the last one. The scope shouldn't change within a sprint, right? I mean, again, we take it very, very lightly. Oh, this last thing comes up. Sure, we'll take it. But before you know it, your sprint is bloated, and yet again, you're not going to hit your goal. So just be very precious about what comes into what the scope is about of your sprint, and try to keep to that as much as possible. And then the next thing that I think is absolutely critical in terms of a sprint is the capacity of the team. And I think people don't spend enough time, and whether you do story points, whether you do days, it doesn't really matter. You still need to make sure that you look at capacity. What can each person do? What can they really accomplish within a given sprint? Don't forget to take into account people's vacation. You just keep planning 2-week sprints, but a person is out 3 days. You shouldn't give that person, 2 weeks worth of work or 10 days worth of work, right? That doesn't make any sense. Plan for that. Plan for a buffer. So again, we're all humans. I go to lunch, hopefully, or maybe I go pick up my lunch. I have meetings. I will talk to a coworker. I will work on bugs. Those eat into your buffer. So make sure you set that. At One Kings Lane, when I was there, we used a 60% buffer. So 60% was basically the actual work time. So that I knew that and that didn't even include vacations, anything like that. I knew that I was realistically going to hit our goals. Lastly, don't forget QA. That's another thing that people forget. We do all these estimates, and all we do is we do the dev estimates, and we don't do the QA estimates. Guess what? You're still not going to hit your goal. So take into account, again, when you're estimating, you're really looking at actual, again, if it's story points, etc., but you're still looking at the amount of time a person can work. Doesn't include the weekend, guys. And then lastly, in terms of when you're ready to kick it off, don't forget to reflect back. I can't stress enough, I mentioned it already earlier, the importance of a retrospective. You really can only get better if you're willing to look at your learnings, whether your successes or failures, and actually use them to become better. So, typical things, right? What did we do well? What do we need to improve upon? What questions do we still have? Make sure that with all those three, you actually set up action items with owners. Because otherwise, if you don't, guess what? Then it's just a venting session. Oh, this person didn't give me the right specs. Oh, the designer didn't give me the mock-ups in time, or it was I had a lot of errors. I didn't get all the cases. Don't let it be a bitch fest, guys. Make sure there are action items with owners. And then lastly, make sure you take it back to your vision. How can we be better? And hey, we talked about our vision. Are we still on track to get there? We're on sprint 6, but we planned out 10 sprints. Are we on track, or do we need to course correct? Do we need to relook at the end state? Or are we finding that we shift something that maybe it doesn't really work anymore and we kind of have to change our end state? So a pro tip that I like to use when I do sprint planning and retrospectives, etc. Combine it all. I know people are always like, oh, more meetings, I can't take this. I don't want to sit in any more meetings. Do it all in one sitting. Review the previous sprint. Talk about the goal. Was it achieved? This is when you can close tickets. Again, making sure that you talk about whether that goal was met is the biggest thing you should take away from that. And then you should follow it with the retrospective itself. Reassess. Are there any course corrections? What are the action items? Make sure that you do that while it's still fresh, and then right there plan for the next sprint so that when you leave that room, you already have the goals for the next sprint, the engineers are ready to go, and you just rinse and repeat. Hopefully you're doing this now. How many people are actually doing Agile, but do separate sprint planning and separate retrospectives? I mean, you might want to consider combining it. It might feel really painful because then you end up having, like, let's say an hour and a half meeting, maybe 2 hours. But what I've done is maybe, depending, but maybe do it over lunch, order in pizza, order in something. It does help, I think, in terms of like just trying to be as efficient as possible with your time. And then you want to check in and repeat. It's the stand-up, right? This is where you check in to make sure that everything is working accordingly, everything is still on track. So it's sort of the standard. You're asking what was done yesterday, what did you work on, what did you complete, what are you working on today, and what are the roadblocks? And then you do it all over again. But keeping in mind that you need to be flexible. So the path that you set out with your vision might not always be, it's not set in stone. So you're going to need to be able to course correct. So don't get frustrated if you have to course correct. Don't be so set with just one path. It's never linear. So just make sure that you're able to understand that. Focus on your vision. That's the most important thing. Don't obsess about the little failures in each sprint. Learn from them, move on. And then lastly, do the work. I realize it sucks. A lot of engineers don't love Agile, don't love Scrum. Maybe they prefer Kanban. So do what works for your team, but do the work. Make sure you do the planning, spend the time, because you can't hit your vision if you're not willing to do the hard work. Thank you very much. I really appreciate you guys coming out. Like I said, all right, questions? Yes.
Sounds like you worked on a lot of products. Which one that you worked on had the most interesting set of problems going in that led to success?
So, I mean, I work in e-commerce and retail, so a lot of people will say, well, it's not the most interesting thing because you're selling widgets or you're selling something, right, at the end of the day. But the most interesting and the most challenging are usually the products, and people tell me, oh, it can't be done. So at Zappos, there was a feature that was only available if you called customer service, basically exchanging a size, a color, etc. You can only do that if you called customer service. When I started there, they told me, well, we don't want to do it. We don't want to put it online because it costs too much money. We'll have too much inventory out. We don't know if customers are going to send it back. And there was definitely this sort of like, it was the big thing that we could never do. And so the one core value that we have was delivering wow through service. And I thought, well, it didn't say through customer service. The site should not be segmented that way. And so somebody threw down the gauntlet. I took it. And so we had to break that down. So sitting down saying, okay, what are sort of the missions or the sprints that would allow us to get to the point of safely and financially being able to be responsible getting this out the door. And so we did our first sprint. That was the MVP, and it was purely, hey, you want to do this online, call customer service. There was an appetite. Definitely did the financials. And then each sprint along the way, or each couple of sprints, we made sure to ship something so that we had the incremental features going out so that we can continue to measure the success of it until ultimately we had the full thing out. To me, it was the most exciting and the most rewarding because one, it truly was something that benefited the customer. Just think about like if you bought a pair of sneakers and it didn't fit, a lot of times you don't want to have to call customer service. You want to be able to self-service on the site, especially for a company like Zappos. And then being told that it wasn't a doable thing, I mean, that just made it even more rewarding. So that was my favorite one. Yes.
How do you create a vision without getting too muddied in solution territory?
I mean, that's a great question. I mean, I really think, and this is going to be a pretty esoteric answer, so I'm going to apologize in advance. I think this is where you have to separate yourself from the solution, and that's sort of like the mental exercise that you're going to have to do. I think it comes with time, and you probably will have to write your vision over and over because the first time you're going to be like, okay, well, how am I going to build this? This is impossible. And you put all these guardrails because you're looking at purely just sort of what is it doable. So, I mean, there's a few sort of like exercises that you can do, like just look at the problem that you're trying to solve and then maybe, again, divorce the solution portion by saying, okay, well, this is one way, how would, Facebook, really bad idea, but whatever. Facebook, Apple, Amazon, Netflix, or Google handle it. So I look at like the FANG companies and then say, okay, how would they solve this problem? Just trying to get out of the norm and get out of that normal box thinking will hopefully encourage you to stop thinking about just sort of the practicalities. You gotta allow yourself to dream, right, as a product manager. So those kind of mental exercises, unfortunately, it's just repeat will help you do that. Because then when it comes to strategy planning, you have to be able to do that and then get down to the tactics and how we're actually going to do this. Hopefully that's a little helpful. Hi.
You talked about crafting a vision. What do you think is a good mechanism to communicate it to the internal project team and then external stakeholders? So for the internal one, what I've typically done is you do project kickoffs. And so I do this thing called a one-pager template that actually has the fleshed out vision, maybe talks a little bit about like how are you going to measure success, who's doing it well, etc. And before I even start, before we even talk about sprint planning, etc., we have this sort of kickoff with the team to get them excited about that, and maybe even sort of use it as a brainstorm because the vision is it's bold, it's clear, but there are the tactics that roll under that, right? So your ability to brainstorm with your team will get them excited. So that's what I typically do. And then in terms of external, the rest of the company, either I will do, and again, tell me if this is too much of a tactical answer, but like a lunch and learn, I might do like a bit of a roadshow. I'll get myself invited to a marketing meeting or the executive meeting, and then that's where I present it, or during an all hands, depending on how big or small it is. So, yes.
Have you worked on any projects for which elements did not work, and if yes, why?
Yes, yes.
So when I was at One Kings Lane, one of the big things that we had to do, we were acquired by Bed Bath & Beyond in June 2016. One of the big things that we had to do was, just like any sort of like acquisition, we did this at Zappos as well, is you look at your tech stack and then you look at sort of your parent tech stack and see what you can do in terms of integration for economies of scale. The challenge is not everybody works in Agile. And so this is where a lot of times Agile will not work because you've got all of these cross tech teams that don't necessarily work the same way. And you kind of have to find sort of a way to meet in the middle. So that's actually been something that I've been looking at, sort of, okay, well, they function as a waterfall organization, but we function as Agile. I think the best way is just making sure that you communicate, and you can then internally make sure that your deliverables are still being done in an iterative fashion, but to them, you're delivering the big thing, whatever that is. It fails because it becomes a big bang approach. And so when we first, just speaking very openly, when we first completed the integration, we had a lot of features that fell out. We had a lot of bugs. We had a lot of performance issues. I mean, that just really happens because you're not iterating. You're just sort of like, okay, big bang. So definitely not something I recommend, but unfortunately, it's those situations when it's a big project with a lot of cross-technical teams that typically happens. So hopefully you don't have to deal with it. Yes?
My world is focused on partners, so a lot of external organizations. You forget it, parents, child, acquired.
Yes.
When your whole world is outside your four walls, how do you rationalize in that child?
I mean, again, it's going to be the same challenge, right? Because unless your partner works in that similar fashion, I think this is where maybe you sit down, which we've done with some partners as well when I was at One Kings Lane, where you sit down and say, okay, this is how we do things. How do you guys do things? Can we meet in the middle and agree on like a shared process? So that's one way that we've had it work.
22 processes.
Yeah, I know. And maybe there's sort of a way for you just to codify your way and say, hey guys, this is how we're doing it. But I mean, no silver bullet, because if you're working with multiple ones, I don't have a great answer. I am sorry.
That's cool.
Yes.
I had a quick question with regards to product road mapping.
Yeah.
Do you have any pro tips with regards to that, whether it's certain tools, whether it's like Gantt charting? Because oftentimes, depending on how many verticals you cover, you have different tasks or projects, like sprints. Then you have different priorities are constantly shifting, then there's delays.
Yes.
And so I feel like my product roadmap is constantly like stale. Even though you're trying to update it, like it's just not.
What a great question.
So I'm trying to figure out, is there certain tools that you use that you recommend?
Well, I guess let's start with a framework. I'm going to take a step back. I think it's everybody's challenge that the roadmap always has to change. And I think that's okay. That's one thing that you have to make peace with yourself, because again, it's the nature of like course correcting. It's the nature of being somebody that works in a digital world, right? Technology changes super quickly. What I would say is maybe getting into a cadence of at least trying to course correct every quarter, so that making sure that your roadmap is at least very fresh for that quarter, and again, course correcting the following one. So that's one way. In terms of tools and how you visualize it, I think some people want to look at Gantt charts. Some people like to look at it in a table. Some people like to look at it in swim lanes. There's a lot of tools out there. The most recent one that I used, and again, not good or bad, but is a tool called RoadMonk.
Say that one more time.
RoadMonk.
Monk.
Yeah, like chipmunk, but with RoadMonk. Again, not good or bad. I'm sure other tools, like I've wanted to try ProdPad, I've wanted to try a couple of ones, but the reason I liked RoadMonk at one point, I don't use them anymore just because I have a new job, is that you can visualize it in any way that you want. So they actually give you that capability, so that depending on who your sharing it with. You might want to do the Gantt chart because you're doing it with your team. You might want to do it in a swim lane view because you're doing it with like stakeholders, etc. So that's a nice, very flexible tool to use. But yeah, the framework, start with that because you got to get comfortable. It's going to change. And I'm with you there. It's just painful. But try to at least get it to like quarter over quarter if you can.
Yeah, I try it every month. It's just our priorities are dictated by our clients.
Oh, yeah.
And we have like 5 verticals.
Yes,
so
yes.
It's a little challenging in terms of like toolbox.
Yes, absolutely. And maybe up-leveling the roadmap a little bit, right? Because your roadmap isn't your backlog.
You have to use like user stories or epics. It has to be things that are like devs too.
Really?
Yeah.
So maybe it's that too, right? It's the philosophy around the roadmap. Because to me, it needs to be up-leveled. Like what you're talking about, it changes daily, but to me, that's more of the backlog. And again, same thing. It will change daily, so maybe there's a way to separate the two if possible.
Yeah, we have like a 1 year, 3 year, 5 year, 10 year, one of those plans.
Yes.
But it's like how do you reach that 1 year plan?
Yeah, that's a rough one.
Yeah.
So hopefully I gave you some tips, maybe.
I'll
try. Yeah. Road monk, yeah. Person in the back.
Question on your thoughts on when you have multiple projects that the same engineering team is working on and dealing with context. I mean, this is growing trajectory.
Yes.
You have separate teams.
Yes.
Project. What are your practices to sort of get out of this context switch where what you don't want are people sitting in Scrum meetings all day long for 4 different projects?
And I mean, but they're not working on them at the same time, right? Because that's not
parallel release.
Some of them are.
Ooh. But so for, let's say I'm one of your engineers, am I working on 3 different types of projects at any given time?
Yeah, so a good example maybe from One Kings Lane might be you have sort of, or even Zappos, you might have a customer service interface, right, that you're building to launch, and the front end that you're building to launch, and they both need to go at the same time.
So, I mean, as much as possible, and again, it's one way because I've been in those shoes. I try to at least dedicate one engineer, or however, one type of project to a given engineer / group of engineers, because it's to your point, the context switching is terrible for them. Now, granted, I've had engineers who actually like that. They want to put something down and pick something back up. And so that's sort of the trade-off, and you have that conversation with that engineer. It's sort of like you want to work with 3 different projects. Unfortunately, you have to come to these stand-ups because otherwise you will be wasting their time. I agree with you, but I think it truly is because of that. The one way that I've had it work is just by having those conversations with my engineers, saying, "What is the preference, guys? We could do a universal stand-up, talk about all 4 things, or we could do mini stand-ups, so that way not everybody is getting bogged down."
I'm hesitant to do universal stand-ups just because
it's terrible. Yes, it's terrible.
Gravitate towards the wrong thing. But if you have any practices on how to manage universal stand-ups,
I mean, you go through one project at a time and people flit in and out. It's truly that. I mean, there's no, again, silver bullet. I think at the end of the day, you really should sit down and talk it over with your tech lead, and their preference, and maybe the engineering team's preference. It sounds like maybe it's not that huge. Even if you're talking about 10 engineers, it's probably a good way to do the mini stand-ups. Hopefully.
Minimize stand-ups, but we need to do stuff.
Yes, yeah. So we did, because at one point had a shared pool. We did it by project. So, but we still did it because you still need that, right? And so there were a couple of engineers who had to go to a couple ones, but it wasn't all of them.
Just what we've done at our company, we've actually done stand-ups in written form, like on Slack or on Confluence.
Yeah.
And then we have a weekly meeting by vertical, so that people can talk about what they've been working on, challenges.
That's really good.
Based on the vertical.
Got it. I mean, that's another way to try. That sounds good too.
I have a question. So the way I have approached product prioritization, I have gotten into some frameworks where I have considered what is market differentiation and what is critical for
Yep.
the mission
Yep.
kind of approach. But I'd like to hear from you as to what kind of product prioritization approaches have you taken in the past, and just one more question around A/B testing as well and your approach around that.
So product prioritization, so feature prioritization, I guess.
Yeah.
I mean, ultimately, I look at the value because, again, if I start with going back to the why and what my goals are, that's going to dictate the prioritization. I will look at is there some sort of back of the napkin envelope that I can do in terms of sizing this opportunity, and then coupled with that is at the very least some sort of t-shirt sizing, because you're not going to know, right? Some sort of t-shirt sizing in terms of the effort, and those two are basically the inputs that I use to make my prioritization decision. But there's got to be like unfortunately we live in a practical world, there's got to be like some sort of ROI that you attach to it, even if it's back of the envelope. And you can ask me your A/B testing question later.
Sure.
Yeah.
Your hand.
Thanks, guys.